14 months. That was the number the man from Peacham Savings Bank wrote on a slip of paper and slid across his desk to me on a Tuesday morning, the 9th of July, 1963, like it was a grocery list instead of a death sentence. 14 months to make good on a note my grandmother had let slide for 3 years before the cancer took her in May. And 14 months, he said, looking at me the way you'd look at a calf that had wandered into a hardware store, was generous. "You're 18, he said, not a question. He had a mustache the color of wet ash, and he tapped his pen twice against the desk before he set it down, like even the pen didn't want to be part of what he was about to say. Goose Farm's not a farm anymore, son. It's 40 acres and a debt with feathers on it. I didn't argue with him. My grandmother raised me not to argue with men who already believed they were right, because it wasted breath you'd need later. I took the paper, folded it once, and put it in my shirt pocket, and I could feel it there the whole 4 miles home, riding in the bed of a 1951 International pickup that Delbert Ainsley from the co-op had been kind enough to loan me for the day, since my grandmother's truck hadn't started since March. 412 geese. That's what I had left after the flu took 130 of them the winter before she died, and after word got around the county that the old Pruitt place was going under, and men started showing up at the gate with offers that weren't offers so much as a polite word for taking advantage of a boy who didn't know better. 12 cents a pound live weight, one of them said, standing in the yard with his hat pushed back, looking at my birds like he was doing me a favor just by naming a number. The county extension agent said something similar 3 days later, standing at the fence with his clipboard, telling me geese were a dying business, that down was cheap synthetic fill now, that I ought to clear the flock and put the acreage to hay or dairy heifers like a sensible operation. He wasn't unkind about it. He just talked the way men talk when they've never once been wrong enough to learn caution. I said thank you for his time. I said I'd think on it. What I didn't say was that I had already been up in the attic 3 nights running, past midnight, with a kerosene lamp and a busted lock I'd had to pry with a screwdriver, going through a trunk nobody in my family had opened since before the war. My great-grandmother's trunk, full of quilting patterns gone soft and brown at the folds, and letters in a handwriting so fine and slanted it looked like thread itself. 14 months. I had already started counting differently than the banker meant me to. The lamp threw a circle no bigger than a dinner plate, and outside that circle, the attic went on being dark in a way that made me feel the whole shape of the house pressing down. Rafters furred with dust, a window at the gable end iced over so thick I couldn't see the yard, though I knew the geese were down there somewhere in the dark, folded up against each other in the shed my grandmother had built with her own hands in 1931. It was the 9th of January, a Wednesday, 11 degrees by the thermometer nailed to the porch post, and I'd told myself I was up there looking for a deed, some paper that might explain the debt more kindly than the banker had. What I found instead was cloth. Bolts of it, folded patterns cut from newspaper dated as far back as 1911, and beneath those, wrapped in a flour sack gone the color of weak tea, a stack of letters tied with string that came apart in my hands like it had been waiting to. The letters were from my great-grandmother to a sister in Bar, and most of them were the ordinary business of a farm woman's year: butter prices, a sick child, a husband's bad knee, but 3 of them, written across 2 winters, were about geese. Not the birds themselves so much as what came off them. She wrote about washing down in rainwater instead of well water because the iron in the well left it dingy. She wrote about a grading process, sorting by hand in good light, feathers in one pile and down in another, and about a woman 2 farms over who'd taught her to do it, a woman whose name she wrote only as Mrs. Ainsworth, like that was explanation enough. She wrote about how a properly cleaned down quilt would outlast a marriage, and I remember reading that line twice by the lamp because it struck me as something a person writes only half joking. I sat on the floor of that attic until my legs went numb from the cold coming up through the boards, reading a dead woman's handwriting by a light no brighter than a match, and I did the arithmetic without wanting to. 14 months to the note, 20-some letters, a method nobody living had used since before my grandmother was my age. Down at the general store, selling for pennies, because everyone had gone over to the synthetic fill the agent kept talking about, cheap and flat and gray, nothing like what these letters described. I didn't sleep that night, not from the cold, though the cold didn't help. I sat at the kitchen table with those letters spread out under the good lamp and started making a list in my own notebook. Rainwater, not well. Good light. Grade by hand. Outside, past the frosted window, the geese were quiet, and I understood before dawn that I would not be selling them. The list grew longer before the sun came up. Rainwater, not well. She'd underlined that twice, and I didn't know why yet, only that a woman who had raised 9 children and buried 3 of them on this hillside didn't underline things without reason. I found out later it was the iron in our well water, how it dulls the white and makes the down go brittle, but that morning I only copied what she wrote and trusted her the way you trust a doctor's handwriting even when you can't read half of it. I went out before light to check on the birds, and the cold had that particular bite Vermont gets in late January, the kind that makes the inside of your nose stick together. 14 of them were still on the pond side of the yard, huddled against the lean-to my grandmother had built out of scrap tin sometime before I was born, and they watched me the way geese do, like they were deciding whether I'd earned the right to be trusted yet. I hadn't, not then. I did the arithmetic again standing out there, because a man does foolish arithmetic when he's scared, hoping it comes out different the second time. 14 months. The note at Peacham Savings was $240, due in installments through March of the following year, and the balance after that was still north of what I could imagine having in a shoebox, let alone a bank account. 22 geese, if I counted the 2 goslings that had made it through the fall. A method that hadn't been practiced, best I could tell from the dates on those letters, since 1911. I went back inside and read the recipe part again, if you could call it a recipe, more like a set of instructions handed down the way you'd tell a child how to tie a knot, assuming the child was watching your hands the whole time, and not just listening to your words. Wash gentle, she wrote, never wring, dry slow, out of direct sun, turning by hand every hour until it lifts on its own, like it wants to fly again. That last part stopped me, like it wants to fly again. I didn't know if that was a woman being sentimental about her work or a woman describing something precise enough to matter, and I decided, sitting there at that table with the lamp burning low and the letters gone soft at the folds, that I'd find out which by trying it myself before spring came around and made the decision for me. I banked the stove that night thinking about rainwater barrels and cheesecloth and how a man was supposed to learn a dead woman's hands from paper alone, and somewhere past the window one of the geese called out once into the dark, like it already knew what I'd decided before I'd said it out loud to anyone. The next morning, I counted backward from the date on the bank letter, the one that gave me until October of the following year, and worked out that I had 13 months and 11 days left, which sounded like plenty until I laid it against a Vermont winter and realized most of that time would be spent just staying warm enough to think straight. I wrote the number on the inside cover of my grandmother's ledger in pencil, small, the way you'd write something you didn't want to see too often but needed close by, and underneath it, I wrote 13 months, 11 days, first batch not yet begun. I started that Thursday, the 16th of January, 1964, with 4 pounds of down I'd been collecting in a lard tin since October, molted feather by molted feather, off the backs of birds who never once thanked me for the trouble. I filled a wash tub with rainwater I'd caught in a barrel off the barn eave, because the letters were specific about that too. Well water carries iron, she'd written, and iron will yellow the down before it ever sees a pillow slip, and I warmed it on the stove until it was no more than blood warm, testing it against my wrist the way you'd test milk for a calf. I washed gentle, I did not wring. My hands wanted to wring, out of habit from every other kind of laundry I'd ever done, and twice I caught myself starting the motion before I remembered and stopped, pressing the water out instead between two clean feed sacks, over and over, until my forearms ached in a way they'd never ached from pitching hay. Then I laid it out on a screen frame I'd built from window mesh and pine strips in the tool shed 2 nights before, up in the loft above the stove, where the air moved slow and warm and no direct light came through the one small window. I turned it by hand every hour just as she'd instructed, through that whole cold afternoon and into the evening, missing supper, missing the 6 o'clock check on the flock, until I heard them getting restless in the yard and had to go out into air so sharp it hurt to breathe and settle them myself. By the third turning, I understood what she'd meant. The down had started the day matted flat and gray-looking, sad, like something already used up. By the 8th hour, it had begun to separate on its own, each cluster pulling apart from its neighbors and standing up off the screen in a way that had nothing to do with my hands anymore. It wasn't flying, but it was trying to, the way she'd said, and I stood there in that cold loft at 9 o'clock at night, with a lantern throwing shadows up the rafters, watching 4 pounds of feather do exactly what a dead woman's letter had promised it would do, and I understood I had 13 months to learn to do this well enough to matter. 13 months. I wrote the number on the inside cover of my own notebook that night, in pencil, and under it the date, Tuesday, the 11th of December 1963, so I would never be able to tell myself later that I hadn't known exactly how much rope I had. The note at Peacham Savings Bank came due the 14th of February 1965, $412 of principal plus what the loan officer called accrued, which I understood to mean more than I could count in my head standing in his office. I did the arithmetic every few days that winter, the way another boy might have checked a clock. 13 months, then 12 months and 3 weeks. The number shrank the way frost shrinks off a window in the first hour of sun, so slow you can't see it moving, and then you look back and it's gone. I brought the down from the loft the next morning in a flour sack and spread it across the kitchen table before I'd even started the stove, and my grandmother's letter sat propped against the sugar bowl where I could read it while I worked. Her handwriting small and slanted and economical with ink, the way people were economical with things in her time. She wrote about grading before she wrote about cleaning, said a woman who couldn't tell the difference between belly down and back down by feel alone had no business calling herself a finisher, and that the difference wasn't something you could teach with words, only with hours. I didn't have hours to spare on things that couldn't be taught. But I had them to spare on things that could, if I was patient with my own clumsiness, and so I sat at that table until my fingers went stupid and cold numb, pulling clusters apart by touch, with my eyes closed, the way she'd apparently done it, until I could tell you blind which handful had come off a breast and which off a wing, without looking down at either one. Mrs. Odette Fenwick from 3 farms over drove past on the Tuesday after Christmas and saw me out in the yard collecting molt off the fence wire where the geese had rubbed themselves against the posts, and she slowed the truck down enough to roll her window and holler that I ought to be at the sale barn in St. Johnsbury on Thursday if I wanted real money before spring, and I said thank you, ma'am, and kept pulling down off the wire with 2 fingers, cluster by cluster, into the same flour sack. She didn't roll the window back up right away. She sat there a moment watching me do it, the truck idling, exhaust hanging low in the cold, before she shook her head once and drove on toward town, and I heard later that same week, from the woman who ran the register at the feed store, that Odette Fenwick had told half the county there was a boy out past the Cabot Road, picking feathers off a fence like he didn't have a farm to run, and that the name stuck to me before the month was out, easy as that, the way names do when nobody bothers to ask why first. 382 days. That was the number I had started keeping in the back pages of the ledger, the same green cloth ledger that had her handwriting in the front half and mine, starting somewhere around page 40, and every night after the stove had burned down to coals, I would cross one more day off against the 14 months the lawyer had written into his letter, the one that said the note at the bank would come due in full, come the following October, principal and what interest had built on it since she passed, and no extension offered beyond what courtesy the bank president felt like showing a boy he had known since he was small enough to sit on the counter at the feed store. 382 days, and I had a flour sack half full of down and a stack of letters in a hand, faded to the color of weak tea, and not much else to show for it yet, which was the thing that kept me up some nights doing the arithmetic over and over, like it might come out different if I added it up enough times. The name did what names do. It went ahead of me into rooms I hadn't walked into yet. I noticed it first at the feed store the second week of January, when I came in for wire, and the man behind the counter, Delbert Cray, said, "There's the feather boy," before he said good morning, and laughed like it cost him nothing. And maybe it didn't cost him anything, but I felt it land somewhere behind my sternum all the same. A small flat stone dropped into still water. I paid for the wire. I didn't say anything back. My grandmother used to tell me that a name only sticks to you if you flinch when you hear it, and so I made myself not flinch, though I won't pretend it was easy standing there with Delbert Cray grinning at me over the register while old man Higby laughed along from where he sat by the stove with his coffee. What I did instead was go home and read the letters again, the ones from the attic trunk, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first 3 times through. A line where my great-grandmother wrote to her sister in Bar that the down had to be washed in 3 waters, not 2, or it would carry a smell that no amount of drying would take out, and that most women in the county didn't bother with the 3rd water because it doubled the work for what looked like the same result, and that this was, she said, exactly why so few of them ever got asked back to do it twice. I sat with that line a long while by the lamp, 3 waters instead of 2. It seemed like such a small thing to build a winter on, but it was the first instruction I had that told me not just what to do, but why the others weren't doing it. The number stuck with me the way certain numbers do, turning over each night before sleep. 14 months from the day the county lawyer read the note aloud in that back office in Peacham had already worn down to 11, and 11 felt thinner than 14, in a way that had nothing to do with arithmetic. I started counting differently after that night by the lamp. Not months anymore, but weeks, because weeks were the unit the work came in, and the work was what stood between the farm and the bank's calendar. The next morning, a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January 1964, with the thermometer nailed to the porch post, reading 4 degrees before the sun came over the ridge, I hauled 3 galvanized tubs into the kitchen and set them on the floor where my grandmother used to do her wash, and I filled the first with water heated on the stove until it ran warm, but not hot, because the letters were clear that hot water matted the down and ruined the loft that made it worth anything at all. I worked through a bushel basket of clean molted down that had been drying in mesh sacks in the woodshed since October, and I put it through the first water, then wrung it as gentle as I could stand, watching my own hands like they belonged to somebody I was still getting to know, then the second water, and by the time I got to the 3rd, the water my great-grandmother said doubled the work for what looked like the same result. My back ached in a way it hadn't ached even hauling feed sacks, and the kitchen smelled of wet feather and wood smoke, and I understood for the first time in my life why a person might quit at 2. I didn't quit at 2. I laid the down out on cheesecloth stretched over the drying racks I'd built from scrap lath, and I went out to do the evening chores, and when I came back in past dark and touched what I'd washed, it was different. Not by much, but different. Lighter under the fingers, no catch of oil or must when I brought a handful up close and breathed it in, only the clean, cold smell of the barn in winter, which is really no smell at all, which was exactly the point. I wrote the date in the ledger I'd started keeping alongside my grandmother's, January 21st, 1964, first full batch, 3 waters, 11 months to the note, and under it, I wrote what I still didn't know, which was more than what I did. How much down it would take to fill a single pillow the size the store sold for $2 and change. How many geese I'd need to molt clean through spring to have enough for more than a handful of them. And whether anybody in Caledonia County would pay for something they couldn't tell apart from the stores by looking, only by sleeping under it. I found the answer by accident, the way most answers on that farm seem to arrive, not through asking, but through being in the room when something else was happening. It was a Tuesday, the 28th of January, and I was in the attic again looking for more of the letters, because I'd read the ones I had so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth at the folds. What I found instead was a scale, small, brass, the kind used for weighing letters before the post office started doing it for you, tucked into a hat box with a card pinned to the lid, in handwriting I didn't recognize as my grandmother's, or my great-grandmother's either, a hand older than both, cramped and careful. The card read, 2 ounces, good pillow, 4 ounces, better, nothing else. No name, no date I could find, though I turned that hat box over looking for one. I brought the scale down to the kitchen table and weighed what I had left from the January batch, the part I hadn't already spoiled learning how to wash it. 6 ounces. Enough, by that card's arithmetic, for 1 good pillow and a start on a second. I sat with that number a long time, the wood stove ticking behind me, the dog asleep against the door where the draft came through worst, and I did the kind of math a boy does when he's trying to talk himself into believing a 14-month debt can be paid with feathers. 40 geese. If every one of them molted clean and I lost nothing to spoilage or bad washing, 40 geese might give me enough down by June to fill 20 pillows, maybe a dozen of the lighter comforters my great-grandmother's letters kept circling back to, the ones she called coverlets, like it was a different word for a different century. I didn't have 40 geese. I had 11. I wrote that down too, plain as the rest of it, because by then I'd learned not to skip the parts that made the ledger look bad. 11 geese, 6 ounces washed, 10 months to the note. No notion yet of what a person in Peacham or St. Johnsbury would pay for a pillow they'd never seen before and couldn't compare to anything at Fisk's General, but the ordinary kind, stuffed thick and heavy and hot by August. I thought about walking into Fisk's and asking outright what people paid for down goods shipped in from away, and I thought about how fast that question would travel back to Bill Cormier's stove circle, and how it would sound coming out the other side. So instead, I went out to the pen the next morning before light, counted my 11 geese by lantern like I hadn't already memorized every one of them by name and temperament, and started figuring how a boy grows a flock faster than a flock wants to grow on its own. The answer was patience wearing the shape of arithmetic. A goose lays maybe 40 eggs a season if she's willing, and mine weren't inclined to be generous about it in January, not with the ground iron hard and the water trough freezing solid by 4 in the afternoon. I set up a brooder box behind the stove, using scrap lumber and a square of chicken wire Grandma had saved for exactly nothing, which is to say, for exactly this, though she never lived to tell me so. I candled eggs by kerosene light, the way her ledger described, holding each one up to the flame until I could see the shadow of what was or wasn't happening inside, and I threw out 4 in the first week that showed nothing but yolk and stillness. That felt like failure until I understood it was the opposite, knowing which ones to give up on before they cost me 6 more weeks of warmth and feed. 9 months to the note by the time the first goslings came, wet and furious and smaller than my thumb, and I sat up 2 nights running with the stove door cracked so the heat would reach the box without scorching it, because the county extension pamphlet said 65 degrees and my thermometer said I was guessing. Cyrus came by that week with a sack of cracked corn he didn't charge me for, and stood over the box a long while without saying much, which from him was closer to a blessing than any speech. By the second week of March, I had 6 goslings alive out of 9 hatched, and I wrote that number down too, because 6 felt like something a person could build a spring around. I moved the flock training into the far pen where the fence was tightest, taught the goslings to follow the older birds to water, and watched how a gander named Ezra, who'd never done a generous thing in his life, took to walking point for the young ones like he'd been asked to, and agreed, before I even thought to want it of him. 8 months to the note, 17 geese counting the new ones, 4 ounces of clean down banked in the tin, and a fair in August that I hadn't yet let myself say out loud, was the whole plan, the entire shape of what I was building toward, because saying it made it a thing that could be taken from me before I'd earned the right to claim it. I kept working instead. The washing basin, the carding, the long nights with Grandma's notes spread across the table like a map to a country only she and her mother before her had ever visited, and I meant to be the third one to arrive. March came in wet that year, the kind of wet that turns a dirt road into something with its own opinions, and I lost 2 days just getting the truck to the county line and back for a sack of scratch grain. 6 months to the note. I'd started keeping the countdown on the inside cover of Grandma's ledger, a new number penciled in every Sunday morning before chores, and some weeks that number felt like the only honest thing in the house. The tin held 11 ounces by the middle of the month. I knew because I weighed it on the kitchen scale, the way another man might count a roll of bills, turning the dial slow, writing the figure down, even though it hadn't moved from the last time I'd checked it 2 days before. Patience, Grandma used to say, isn't a virtue so much as a math problem you haven't solved yet. I didn't understand what she meant until I was the one doing the arithmetic. Ounces against weeks, weeks against the note against a fare that was still 5 months off, and might as well have been 5 years, for how far away it felt, on a night when the wind came through the north wall of the goose house, and I had to get up twice to check the young ones hadn't scattered from the warmth of the older birds. Ezra kept them close. I'll say that for him. Whatever meanness lived in that bird toward me, he'd spent none of it on the goslings, and I started to wonder if that was just what raising something did to a creature, gander or man, whether you had a choice in the softening or not. I finished the first quilt top that month, not washed and finished, just the top, the pattern Grandma's mother had drawn out in that brittle hand 70 years before, stitched now in thread I'd bought on credit from the dry goods in Peacham, because the account there still had my grandmother's name on it and nobody had told me to change it. 5 months to the note. I held the top up to the kerosene light and saw, for the first time since November, something that looked less like a chore and more like proof. Proof of a claim I still hadn't spoken aloud to another living soul, not to Mr. Whitcomb, not to the extension man, not even to the Hutchins boy who came by some Saturdays to help me haul feed and never once asked what all the down and thread were for. I didn't tell him. I wasn't ready for anyone to ask me what happened if it wasn't enough. April came in wet, the mud season the old farmers talked about like a war they'd survived, and I counted 4 months to the note by scratching the days off a feed store calendar tacked above the cellar stairs. 4 months. I said it out loud sometimes, alone, just to hear how it sounded next to the work still ahead of me. 22 more tops to piece, the washing and carding of down that still hadn't been touched from the January collection, sitting in flour sacks in the cellar smelling faintly of tallow soap and cold stone. I worked by lamplight until my eyes burned and by daylight until my hands cramped around the needle, and somewhere in that stretch I stopped sleeping more than 5 hours a night and didn't much notice the loss. Mr. Whitcomb drove past twice that month, slow, the way a man drives when he wants to be seen looking without being caught at it. He didn't stop either time. I kept at the clothesline stringing wet down to dry in the wind, kept at the loft sorting grade from grade the way the letters had taught me, kept at it the way you keep at, bailing a boat that's taking on water faster than you'd like to admit, not because you believe you'll win, but because the alternative is watching it go under with your hands in your pockets. 3 months to the note by the last week of May, and I had 11 finished quilts stacked in the spare room upstairs, wrapped in muslin against the dust, and 6 pillows besides. And I still didn't know a single soul in Caledonia County who'd pay money for such a thing, only the ghost of a promise in a great-grandmother's handwriting that somebody once had. I wrote a letter that week to the Fair Board in St. Johnsbury, asking about a booth, keeping my hands steady on the pen, the way I'd learned to keep it steady on the needle, and I walked it to the post office myself, rather than trust it to the rural carrier, because some things you want to watch leave your own hand. 2 months to the note when the Fair Board wrote back. I remember the postmark, the ordinary blue ink of it, sitting on the kitchen table while I did the milking, unopened for the better part of an hour, because I'd decided that whatever it said, I wanted 5 minutes first of not knowing. The letter said yes. A booth, 6 feet by 8, $12 for the weekend. Corner space near the exhibition hall because I'd asked for shade and they'd had none left near the entrance. I paid the $12 in cash the following Tuesday and drove the truck home slower than usual, the way a man drives when he's carrying something he doesn't want to jostle. The fair opened on a Thursday, the 6th of August, 1964, hot and close, the kind of Vermont summer day that makes the cattle barn smell like a hayfield left too long in the sun. I set the quilts on a folding table my grandmother had used for church suppers, pillows stacked beside them, a hand-lettered sign that said simply, "Goose down," washed and grated by hand, and I stood there at 8 in the morning, with my stomach doing something I didn't have a word for. By 10, there was a line. Not a crowd, a line, the kind that forms outside a bank on the day it might not open. Women pressed the quilts between their fingers the way you'd test bread for doneness, felt the weight of them, or the absence of weight, and said things to each other in low voices I wasn't meant to hear. By noon Thursday, the 11 quilts were gone. By Saturday afternoon, the pillows were gone too, and a man from a dry goods concern in Burlington had written his name and a standing order on the back of a feed receipt because it was the only paper either of us had. I stood at the edge of the cattle barn that evening, the sun going down orange over the hills, and I watched a man I'd known my whole life buy a pillow at the very last hour, quietly, paying in coins he counted twice, and carry it off under his arm without once looking back at me. He never said a word about it, not that day nor any day after. I never asked him to. 2 months of the 14 were still left when I walked into the Peachum Savings Bank and paid the note in full. And the man behind the desk shook my hand like he was shaking the hand of someone he'd have to explain to himself later. I still keep geese. I taught the washing and the grading to a cousin of mine, 10 years old and patient in the way only a few people ever are, so that whatever my great-grandmother wrote down in that trunk won't sit forgotten in an attic again for 40 years. If somebody's told you you're too young, too green, too soft for the work in front of you, there's likely a drawer somewhere in your family nobody's opened. Go open it. And if you've got a story like mine, tell it below. I'd like to hear it.